that's the first trend, is these high costs, these low returns. The second trend that really begins to command policymaker attention and research attention is this new and growing body of research around what does work to reduce recidivism. This is one example of that new and growing body of research. This is a slide that talks about swift, certain, and proportional sanctions. Some of you might have heard about the HOPE model, a court in Hawaii that began to think differently about how to change offending behavior, rather than taking your probationers and parolees and watching them really closely for when they might violate their conditions of parole and then yanking them back into prison for long periods of time, long revocations. A judge in Hawaii said, let's actually lay out some really clear sanctions. And if they're really clear and they're really swiftly applied, we can actually apply much more moderate sanctions and get the same or better outcomes. And so this is one model of swift, certain, proportional sanctions. A lot of states have actually now moved towards this system. It's more cost effective, and we've seen that it actually does a better job at curbing offending behavior. So a second research principle that's kind of changed the game in corrections has been about the ratio at which we want to balance treatment with supervision. So historic prevailing wisdom was the point of probation and parole supervision was to catch offenders doing something wrong. It was really a surveillance model. It turns out the best research shows that if you balance that surveillance model with a treatment model, you'll get a better return for your investment. And the final principle I'll talk through, and there's many more, is about front-loading resources. So we found that offenders leaving prison are most likely to recidivate in the days and months directly preceding their exit, as opposed to 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And this meant that very long parole terms or focusing on people 3 or 4 years out wasn't as effective as really putting all of your resources into that first moment when offenders are at the highest risk of recidivism. So one dynamic that changes is that we've got this new research about what does work. Another changing dynamic is public opinion. And so we've been doing a lot of polling over the course of the last decade in states and at the national level to begin to ask voters what they want from their correction spending. This is just one example of that. This is a question or a statement that we tested. We have too many low-risk nonviolent offenders in prison. We need alternatives to incarceration that cost less and save our expensive prison space for violent and career criminals. We see pretty strong agreement in a statement like that really is talking about focusing prison space on violent offenders. This is a question that really looks at what voters care more about. Are they more concerned with severity, or are they more concerned with public safety outcomes? And this is a question that gets to length of stay, length of incarceration, and are voters asking us to increase these lengths, or are they really asking us for public safety return? So this is a statement we tested. It doesn't matter whether a nonviolent offender is in prison for 21, 24, or 27 months. What really matters is the system does a better job of making sure that they don't reoffend. And you've got, again, strong agreement and strong total agreement. So all of these new dynamics lead to a really promising trend that we've only seen play out over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, which is those high incarceration rates that you saw in the beginning are beginning to bend back downwards. And so this is that yellow bar is really the beginning of what we hope will be an ongoing trend where states are beginning to push their prison populations back down, and safely. And safely really is the key point here. And so what we've seen, and you can see Texas there, what we've seen is that in the last 5 years, 30 states have been able to achieve less crime and less incarceration at the same time. This is a big shift, right? 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, people didn't know that you could have them both at once. The thought was, in order to get less crime and declining violent and property crime rates, you had to really increase your prison bed capacity. We're seeing now that that's actually not necessarily true. So very briefly before I wrap up, I just want to give 2 case studies. Obviously, we're in Texas, and I hope you've all heard, and if you haven't, you'll certainly hear more about it today, about the really extraordinary championship of sentencing and corrections in this state. Based partly on that leadership, states have really begun to think differently about their correctional spending and their sentencing practices in order to get a better return on their spending. And the way that they've done that primarily has been by looking at the data in their corrections and sentencing system, looking at the research about what does and does not work, and recalibrating their policies and their budgets to get a better return. So I'll start very briefly with Mississippi. Several years ago, Mississippi was confronting a growing prison population. They were due to bring online 2,000 more beds. at the cost of roughly $240 million additional dollars. Mississippi leadership pulled together a task force, began to look at their data and their drivers, and began to match policies to their drivers. So if length of stay was up for property offenders, was it possible to recalibrate and restructure sentencing for those property offenders? And this is just, this is their projected prison population growth. And this is an example, don't expect you to read all these very many policy reforms right now, but this is just an example of how we've worked with states, and states have worked to really create data-driven policy reforms. And so Mississippi policymakers saw that a great proportion of their offenders were sentenced directly to prison, actually a higher proportion than most other states, and most offenders to probation and a minority to prison. Mississippi was actually sending most to prison. And so the policy reform there was about expanding alternatives, right? Making sure that judges were able to divert out to drug courts and mental health courts. Also saw that large numbers of drug and property offenders going to prison. They ended up raising their felony theft threshold, ended up thinking differently about drug sentencing to make sure, again, that they could divert out to drug courts and other kinds of options. And they did a series of sentencing reforms and earned time reforms that began to target length of stay and prison terms, as well as a huge body of strengthening of supervision reform. So looking at implementing swift and certain sanctions, looking at implementing front-loading resources, and these research principles that I talked about earlier. And what we saw with their reform package that they pulled together and passed was a pretty significant impact, not just on public safety and reduced recidivism rates, hopefully, but also on their prison population and taxpayer spending. So Mississippi was able to really bend their prison population downwards. It's actually been able to bend down below even what was projected. It reduced in the last 2 years about 16% and has been saving taxpayers about $266 million since the reforms. Very briefly, a year later, Utah was facing a very large prison population increase and was going to have to build a pretty significantly expensive state prison at about the cost of $500 million. Underwent a really similar process where they looked at the drivers of their correction system, pulled 10 years of their sentencing data going back, 10 years of their corrections data going back, and interrogated these trends. Who's coming in? How long are they staying? What is it costing? What's working really well and needs to be scaled up? What's not working so great and should be scaled back? And pulled together a pretty comprehensive package of reforms that targeted the front end, release policies, and also community supervision. You can look at some of them here, and some of them really resonate with the policies embraced by Mississippi and by the policies that have been embraced here in Texas. A combination of all of those policies pulled together, the state was able to flatline their prison population growth and avoid this very large and costly prison that they had coming online, saving taxpayers approximately $500 million over the next 2 decades. So I'll stop there. There's a growing and large group of states that are really thinking differently. As I said, many of them were really spurred on by the leadership of Texas. I'm happy to take questions at the end of this, but hopefully that's a helpful framework for the rest of the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Zoe, and we're now pleased to turn to State Representative James White, who's just a tremendous leader on these issues in our Texas House, represents East Texas, and he was elected back in 2010. He serves on the Joint Committee on Human Trafficking, the House Select Committee on Mental Health, the House Committee on Juvenile Justice and Family Issues, as well as Vice Chair of the House Corrections Committee. And he graduated with honors from Prairie View A&M with a degree in political science and military science. He's been commissioned by the United States Congress as an officer in the infantry in the U.S. Army, where he has served our nation throughout the world. So please join me in welcoming Representative James White.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I will maintain my military officer's motto on briefings: be bold, be brief, and be gone. So I will probably just say a few things, and definitely I like to come to these types of meetings and listen to questions and answers more as we start going into the next session and doing all our planning for the next session. But, a lot of things I think about when it comes to, criminal justice. I happen to have 3 prison units in my district, big prison units in my district. But I tend to still think that, and of course, they employ a lot of people. Obviously, they're probably maintaining some community safety in the process. But in the back of my mind, as I try to vet criminal justice legislation, I just want to keep a few things in mind. What is really the purpose of our criminal justice system? And I believe, and some of you may have some thoughts about what it is as well, but what I believe, it's to enhance individual liberty in our communities, and the criminal justice contributes to that by protecting our person and our property. I kind of get very frustrated when I go throughout Texas and people are wanting to use the criminal justice system for all sorts of things, generating revenues, enhancing maybe their fiscal position in terms of education and other scenarios, all of which are probably well-intentioned, but that is not really the purpose of the criminal justice system. Also, when you look at the criminal justice system, it gets in line for taxpayer dollars just like every other service that we provide in government. Just because it's criminal justice and it deals with law enforcement, I'm a supporter of law enforcement, obviously. Know a lot of law enforcement people, have a lot of them in my family, but that's not necessarily the reason to blow up their budgets, just so you can say you support law enforcement. I think we support law enforcement by giving them the necessary resources they need and giving them a clear, defined mission and a sound legal code in order to accomplish it. But with that, in the back of my mind is probably just a simple economic concept, Mark, called marginal utility. If you're going to spend that extra dollar in corrections or criminal justice, we must ask ourselves the question, what is the trade-off? Are we really, is that extra dollar, is it likely to make us safer in terms of our communities when we spend that extra dollar? And that's something to always think about. Last session, I was extremely honored to become a disciple, or a deacon, of John Whitmire. I'm working on a few pieces of legislation. We worked on school attendance, and I will go on record again, and those people that are looking at this presentation and on streaming media out in the heartland, I don't foresee any urgency on James White's part. I haven't really talked to my colleague here in the Senate, but I don't see any urgency on James White's part to go back, reopen the code, look at things, change things. I've been to various forums on House Bill 2398. 4 months into it, people are saying, well, when you go back, what are you going to change? Well, first, we're not going to. I don't think we're going to change anything. I will definitely make a good bet that the criminal offense for juveniles, as it relates to school attendance, that's not coming. Now, 179 other legislators in the Texas legislature, you can find anybody to drop a bill, okay? But I don't foresee that coming back. So we need to continue moving forward and asking ourselves, when we are rounding people up to take them into jails, we're rounding them up, taking them into courts, we have to ask ourselves, are they really doing something that I just don't like? Or are they doing something that makes us scared? If they're doing something to make us scared, obviously we want to get them into a scenario where they're not inflicting any fright on our communities. But in many instances, we're finding out that, especially on the juvenile front, that some of our young people are probably doing things that just make us mad as an adult. And James White would say he definitely had the opportunity to do that when he was a juvenile, and no one rounded me up and threw me in jail. Now, Mildred Boyd probably rounded me up and put some leather on my behind, but we were not rounded up and incarcerated. Definitely had the opportunity to work with our senators and other members of the legislature on making sure that we are equipping our offenders as they try to make their transition successful. I'm talking about the adult offenders. They're making their transition successful into free society. And I want all the kudos to Dr. Carpenter and Wyndham in their use of using good, sound, solid data and metrics and coming up with programs and approaches. So last session, we worked on SB 1024. SB 1024 would give Wyndham the ability to award high school diplomas. And based on the metrics, an ex-offender walking out into free society with that high school diploma means huge benefits and dividends for our state. And also, we have a committee that's going on right now, dealing with juvenile records under Chapter 58. Moving forward, I definitely have some interest in pretrial activities. Obviously, we've had a lot of spectacular events throughout the country, definitely here in Texas, concerning our jails, and we really need to make sure our pretrial activities are robust. The United States, like Mark said, I've had the opportunity to travel throughout the world. I love our country. I think we have the best country on earth. We have the best justice system on earth. Obviously, we're always trying to improve it, but I was quite intrigued when individuals are probably arrested by mistake, and people make mistakes, okay, but they're arrested by mistake, and we're wondering moving forward what are the processes that we have in place to ensure that if they are arrested mistakenly, we can get their records right, so that years down the road they don't find somewhere where they're arrested and it was by mistake, and if they're trying to get a job, or as a very senior, a very old constituent in my community wanted to get a concealed handgun license, senator, and found out that he had a mistaken arrest back in the 60s, and it came up, and interestingly, he had served as a public school teacher for at least 3 or 4 decades, and this came up and interfered with his ability to get his CHL. He eventually got his CHL. And then the idea of really digging down deep and looking at how we relate and engage with our young girls that happen to intersect with our criminal justice system, and to ensure that our juvenile justice system, which is doing a great job in improving daily and yearly and all of that, that as we are dealing with our young girls that are intersecting with the juvenile justice system, that we are making the situation better and we're not exacerbating the situation adversely. So those are some of the interests I have, along with some of the interests that my leader here, my friend here, will give me throughout the year into next session. So I will enjoy listening to the further dialogue and your questions.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm so pleased to have our next speaker, Devon Anderson, with us, because she has done amazing work since becoming district attorney in Harris County. She has implemented a pretrial diversion program that she's, I think, going to talk about, that's had incredible success rates with people not going to jail who don't need to be there, but still being held accountable, and also making sure that some of the juvenile misdemeanors are processed by the juvenile probation department without even having to go to court. So it really has been a huge success and change in Harris County, and Teresa May, who's the probation director, has worked hand in hand with her to really reduce recidivism among people on probation. She began her career after graduating from the University of Texas School of Law in 1992, was 12 years working at the Harris County DA's office before becoming a district judge, and also has served as a defense attorney, so she's seen both sides of the ledger. She's received many awards, including from the Association of Women Attorneys, Johnny Clevenhagen Award, and many more. So please join me in welcoming Harris County District Attorney Devon Anderson.
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm glad to be here. I'm going to change. I'm going to get on a different horse, though. I decided after listening to these two talk, I want to talk about what is on my mind right now, which is the MacArthur grant that Harris County has applied for, and I think it's exactly on point with especially what you're talking about. Early last year, the Harris County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, of which I'm a member, decided to pursue this grant that the MacArthur Foundation was offering called the Safety and Justice Challenge. And what it was challenging local jurisdictions to do was to look at their local jails to see how they're being used. Who's in the jail? Should all those people be in the jail? And what kind of people are in the jail? And then come up with a proposal that would reduce the jail population safely and look at racial and ethnic disparity within the jail. So I don't think any of us knew exactly what we were getting into when we started, but this was a partnership between the DA's office, Public Defender's Office, Sheriff's Department, HPD, probation, and pretrial. We had 8 members of a team. We won the first round, so out of 191 jurisdictions around the country, we were in the 20 finalists. And they gave us $150,000 to start doing a data-driven look at the jail. And what came out of that was somewhat surprising, but we all had a pretty good idea. Like most of the country, 65% of our jail population is pretrial detainees, people waiting for trial. And you know what? A lot of those people need to be in jail waiting for their trial because they're charged with murder and capital murder and aggravated robbery, and I guarantee nobody wants them out around us while they're waiting for trial. But there's also a large number of people who, according to a pretrial risk assessment, were evaluated at low or moderate risk. Now, what are those people doing in there? You know what they're doing in jail while they wait for trial? They're losing their jobs. They're losing their apartments. And when they might have been a good probation candidate at the beginning, by the time they're done, they're not a good probation candidate because they have no resources left. So we started looking at how we can fix this, what we can do in Harris County. And I am very proud of the 96-page proposal that we just submitted a couple of days ago. And you'll never hear these words probably cross my lips again, but the Houston Chronicle has an excellent article on... And it was a fair article that was factually accurate. I encourage you to read it on our proposal. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but a lot of it has to do with diversion. But one of the exciting things that what I found when I was district attorney was that we're not going to be building any more jails. And I have to fight for every prosecutor that I get every year. So we have limited resources dealing with this crime. So we have to be smart in how we use these resources. I do not want my prosecutors spending a ton of time on a low-level, nonviolent offender, somebody who will self-correct with a little bit of motivation from the criminal justice system. I want them getting ready for their murder trial on Monday. So that's why I've really been looking at diversion efforts and kind of went out on a limb and started the First Chance program in Houston, 0 to 2 ounces of marijuana. And you're like, why is that going out on a limb? Who cares about dope, especially in this town? I know. The reason it was kind of out there was that I wanted it to be pre-charge. In other words, when an officer had someone in custody for 0 to 2 ounces of marijuana and could confirm that they had never been in trouble with the law before, instead of being taken to jail and booked in and making bond and hiring a lawyer and going to court, I wanted them offered right then and there a chance to have 90 days or 60 days, depending on how they assessed, to do a few things, and then if they did them and stayed out of trouble, we would never file the case. So you can see the benefit automatically to the offender. If they do it, then they have nothing on their record, 0. For the system, we have one less person to book into jail, one less person coming to our misdemeanor dockets where there's 100 people every day crammed into a courtroom. And so the pre-charge aspect was what was kind of revolutionary about it. And we piloted it with the HPD and Sheriff's Office and started in October 2014. And it's been interesting. The recidivism rate has been 0 almost. It's like 5-6%, okay? These people are not coming back. So we've picked the right population. What was difficult, and the culture change of it, was with the police, who are used to taking people to jail. I mean, I understand that. That's what they've always done. So to get them to say, no, I'm sorry, we want you to take them to a substation, print them so we know who they are, and then go through this program with them, tell them they've got 3 days to report to pretrial for an assessment, pay $100, either do 8 hours of community service or an 8-hour cognitive class, and they'll be done with the system at that point. That was difficult. And the Sheriff's Department kind of came around before HPD, which was interesting, and our numbers were skewed. So what would happen is if they weren't offered the program and got to court, we would give it to them then. So we had two populations, a pre-charge population and a post-charge. The recidivism rates were identical. That wasn't a difference. It was that the post-charge people were going to have to go through the expunction process. Pre-charge wouldn't. To date, we've had 1,780 defendants go through it, and of those people, 84% successfully completed the program. So it's very heartening, but I was not happy that the vast majority were getting the program post-charge. So as of January 1st, I sent out an advisory to all 88 law enforcement agencies in Harris County and told them, you're doing this. It's mandatory. You're going to offer this program at the time of arrest, and if you call DA intake for us to take charges, we're not taking charges. We're going to remind you that you need to be offering this person this program. So that started. I still have a job right now. I'm just kidding. They're okay with it. I mean, most police officers on the street are like, thank you. I don't have to go down and do all this stuff for like a joint. Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson. So what we decided to do after that is in February, and this is part of the MacArthur grant as well, I'm expanding First Chance to retail shoplifting cases, Class B misdemeanor, which is the lowest misdemeanor that's jailable. It will start off post-charge, so they'll get it in court. It's going to be a 90-day, we're going to reset their case for 90 days. They'll do a cognitive class, pay any restitution that's owed, and the case will be dismissed. We're starting at post-charge because of the restitution issue. We're trying to figure out how to do that pre-charge. But then the big one is, and this comes from my days as a drug court judge and as a defense attorney, once you've had training in dealing with people with substance abuse issues, you understand that they're a unique population to deal with. And once you're a defense attorney, you understand that if a person has a felony conviction, their lives are over. And the likelihood of them turning to crime to continue to support themselves is very, very high. The state jail population, the recidivism rate out of Harris County is 75%. People who go to state jail on an offense, 75% of them are committing a new crime. And so we are, because of the MacArthur grant, we are tackling that population, which is largely African American, by doing this. People starting February who are charged with 4 grams or less of a controlled substance, and there's no evidence that they're dealing it. They're actually they're users. Who do not have a prior felony conviction. They can have misdemeanors, but not felonies. We're going to offer them a 1-year pretrial diversion, which is resetting their case for a year. They will be assessed by Dr. May's probation department. She has an excellent risk-based instrument, and they will agree to follow her conditions, whether it's a lockdown treatment because you've got such a bad drug problem, or you're just partying, so you're going to do some community service, or you're in the middle, you're about to become a really bad addict, so we'll give you intensive outpatient treatment. Whatever the probation department, who are the experts, decide they need, they will follow, and if they stay out of trouble, we'll dismiss their case. They'll be eligible for expunction 1 year later. We'll see how that goes. I'm pretty excited about it, pretty hopeful. One last thing I want to talk about with the MacArthur grant. One of the things that we're going to do, whether we get the grant or not, is start something that we're calling a reintegration court, where cases of possession of less than a gram, prostitution 4th offender, and theft 3rd offender, these are all state jail felonies, will be direct filed into a special court run by a visiting judge, and it will be a rehabilitation-oriented court, where every person who comes in there will be assessed to find out what their needs are, and they'll either be offered the pretrial diversion I just talked about, depending on their criminal history, or even if they have, 3 or 4 prior felonies for possession, we're going to offer them probation with treatment. Because what we're doing right now ain't working. If 75% of people are coming back to commit more crimes in my jurisdiction, then I'm going to try something new to try to keep that from happening. So I can talk about other aspects of the MacArthur grant if anybody asks me that question later, but right now I'll be quiet and pass it over to Senator Whitmire. I betcha.
Well, thank you so much.
Next.
So yes, it's really remarkable, everything we just heard, and not something I would have expected to hear 10 years ago when I started in this position from the District Attorney of Harris County. And I'll tell you, what's even more remarkable is that it's not going to be a fiscal benefit necessarily, because under our state funding system, I was just telling Chairman Whitmire this, and he knows it already, but we fund our adult probation based on how many people are on probation. So if you have a pre-charge diversion, that's actually the county's going to lose money that they might have otherwise gotten if that person got convicted and went on probation. So we need to fix that funding formula next session. But let me just now turn to the Dean of the Senate, the Chair of the Senate Criminal Justice Committee, John Whitmire, who's been in the Texas legislature since 1969. Thankfully, I don't think about too often what it would be like if he wasn't there. I just am glad that he is, because he has the knowledge and the ability to get things done. As James White has said, anybody can file a bill, but this is a man that can actually get things over the finish line. And he's done it time and time again, leading the 2007 criminal justice reforms, and really every day holding our criminal justice agencies accountable, showing up unannounced at juvenile and state prisons. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Chairman John Whitmire.
Thank you, Mark. And I have a place where I wanted to start, but before I go to my starting point, first let me say what a pleasure it is to be on the panel. Because of time restraints, and I need more time once I get wound up, I don't do panels very easily. But my new partner in crime, James, I wanted to be here, and with Devon Anderson, I could obviously not say anything this morning other than applaud her common sense and tough and smart on crime approach. It's what many of us have been striving for years. And then, of course, the Pew Foundation, Ms. Downs, we appreciate y'all's input and work. I had to remind somebody, I got in trouble in school, can you imagine? Always talking to someone else when I should have been listening to the teacher. But we're not Utah or Mississippi. It's great that you use those examples, but we have to be careful. Utah's probably got the population of my Senate district. I was at a conference one time in D.C., and a lady was talking about their innovation, that there are 1,100 parolees each year. Each had individual mentors. And I thought, well, now that's a hell of a great idea. But where do you find a state with 1,100 parolees when we parole 70,000 people a year? I said, where are you from? North Dakota. I said, well, that's a hell of an idea, but I don't know I can take it back to Texas. So we have to always be mindful of the huge, huge size of our responsibility. First of all, a little background, and I don't have time to give a speech if I was talking to beginners, the Rotary Club or somebody. We're all in this because of public safety. There is no other purpose in having a criminal justice system if you're not making our state and society safer. We're all on board. We all have the same objective. And number two, let me go ahead as I would give if I was talking to beginners, we're all tough on crime. Every one of us in here are tough on crime. We have a responsibility to protect our neighbors, our constituents, our own families. We do not want them to be assaulted, and we need to deal with that. But we haven't always been, but it's refreshing this morning, we haven't always been smart, because you can't just build your way out of here. You can't just be tough. And as I will conclude before I go over a couple of specifics, we have to continue to distinguish who we're afraid of, the capital murderers, the rapists, child offenders, versus those we're mad at. And Ms. Anderson did an excellent job of speaking to those that we're really mad at. And I would suggest, while we're sitting here this morning, there's 300 prostitutes locked up in Gatesville because we're mad at them. I'm not afraid of her, but we don't want her and her business in our community. So years ago, the legislature, after 3 offenses, convictions, made that a felony. So those ladies are in Gatesville, and if they're not getting life skills and drug treatment and an education, they will come back without a reentry program, and we'll see them on the streets again. And I have interviewed them, Kathy Griffin and some of our activists that bring them to my office, and they cry and say, I don't want to be a prostitute, but where am I going to stay and live if I don't have a reentry place? They end up back on the streets. Classic examples. MHMR. There are 32,000 approximately people incarcerated this morning that we have documented last year that were in a mental health program before they ever committed a crime. But because of the reductions in community mental health services, they have a bad day, they assault their family, they call the law, they assault the law officer. Guess what? Welcome to the criminal justice system. So we have to continue at the front end with our mental health courts, do a risk assessment, get them to the right services. They're out of the criminal justice system, and we will have done our job. We will enhance public safety because, one, we're doing the human thing the right to do, but also we're saving millions of dollars. I could cite you the hundreds of millions, and I've actually saw a figure this morning, billions, that we've saved since 2007 with our reforms. Why is that important? The border security this year, we financed it at a cost of $800 million. I could literally document and justify the argument that we have paid for border security resources with what we've saved with smart and tough criminal justice reform. We've closed 3 prisons in the last 2 sessions. We did not build the additional because of the reforms that we implemented in 2007. So let me applaud where we've been, but also fuss and say, as Ms. Anderson said and other stakeholders, we've got a lot worth left to do. I would suggest, talking to my colleague from Harris County, I don't think we have to wait for a grant or a study, as you have demonstrated already. We know some of the problem areas. First, the state jail recidivism. We have those who work in the legislature recognized in recent years because we don't have a treatment mode there. When we did the state jails in 1993, I and Tony Fabello and others who collaborated on that, it was heavy on treatment. As a condition of probation, you would go there. In fact, we really had a model that if you'd go there and do well and get your GED and get off drugs and alcohol, you'd get off probation earlier. But because of budget cuts that have never been restored at that level, now we see defendants plead out for state jail time because they know, one, they're going to go there. Once they get out, there's no condition of probation. We've got to be reasonable on our condition of probation, which I know you and Ms. May are working on. We've got to get away from allowing some oftentimes repeat offenders saying, oh man, I got this figured out. I mess with probation, which why wouldn't you want probation? You got to report. You got to do a urine test. You got the probation fee. Your lawyer's telling you you probably never last on probation. So you go to the state jail, you hang out there with some guys that are probably worse than you. We need to, I think, consider good time at the state jail, build in some incentives. Originally, the compromise with my DA friends was if we're going to send them to the state jail and have lower sentencings for those nonviolent offenses, the trade-off was day for day. We might need to visit some incentives for you, one, to get a GED and some drug treatment there, and you get out a little quicker, but we damn sure need to encourage them to take a probation if it makes sense, if we have reasonable probation deal. Now let me close by saying another high priority that I need everyone's help and attention. And I'm here because the foundation is really doing some good work, Mark. We probably have in Harris County, for example, 1,000 or more misdemeanors sitting there because they can't afford bail. I really, really want us to examine, and I spoke to a large district attorney's office recently, some continuing education classes, and I said, my goal for low-level nonviolent offenders, if you're picked up, pulled over, and you're driving with a suspended license, you go to jail. I want that person to get in and get out. But ladies and gentlemen, I know, you know people that couldn't come up with $1,000 for a $10,000 bond if their life depended on it. They're sitting in Harris County Jail right now. I have friends in the bail bonds business. I understand it's a necessary part of the criminal justice system. But we have to do risk assessments, certainly when it relates to mental health and emotional disturbed individuals. And I don't have time to go there, and I don't want to rehash because there'll be a better venue to do it. But Miss Bland was taken to the Hempstead jail on Friday evening, didn't see a magistrate until 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. Should have seen one early that morning because they knew they had a troubled person just by the sheer incident on the street. At 1 o'clock on Saturday, she was offered a bond and she needed $500 to get out. When the magistrate, the JP there, saw that she was not able to come up with her $500, they could verify that she had a new job at Prairie View. She had an address. Ladies and gentlemen, it would have served everyone involved for her to have been given a 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, a PR bond, to see that she was going to come back to that JP a month later, 2 weeks later, maybe Monday morning, and all of our lives would have been different. Certainly we would, in my judgment, not had a victim. That is not unusual. It's unusual, obviously, the dire circumstances, but I think that we need to be tough and smart on crime, and one of that means a system working. And the problem is, somebody said the other day, well, the judges are afraid of a Willie Horton circumstance. They let someone out on PR bond and they go and harm someone. There's risk involved in everything we do every day. But you make good judgments, and I'm not talking about a Willie Horton who had a violent background. I'm talking about someone that's pulled over on a traffic warrant. Unfortunately, they're driving with a warrant for their arrest because they couldn't pay their traffic tickets. Get them in and get them out and save the resources, as Ms. Anderson's already pointed out, for the really bad people. I think that should be a priority of ours. Early pretrial evaluation, PR bonds, Travis County. I was visiting with an attorney last night. Travis County's system is working, and they lead the way on PR bond. Another side note, tell you what I did this morning, then I'll hush. I read in the Dallas paper yesterday. Their police chief wanted to implement, but he wanted some direction. He went before city council. They approved a pilot program for their officers, and Dallas is very similar in size and diversity and composition as Harris County. They're going to start their police officers, if you have 4 ounces of marijuana or less, writing you a citation. And the police chief gave all the reasons, many of which Ms. Anderson's mentioned with her diversion program, to get them in, get them out, and get back on the streets and catch the really dangerous people. I'm excited about what I've heard this morning. I'm excited by the size of this crowd. We're doing great things, but we can't settle with what we're doing. Most of all, Ms. Anderson didn't point out, she got military courts, mental health courts, DWI courts. I mean, these specialty courts are working, and it leaves you the time to solve these human problems, and then, hey, there ain't nobody tougher on crime than each and every one of us here. We want to continue to be, but we got to deal with those that we're mad at to get back to those that we're afraid of. Thank you for giving me the energy level to do what I do.
Well, thanks so much, and we now have opportunity for audience questions, and let's go down here to the front then, and go ahead. I don't know if we have mics, but just speak loud, I guess. Oh, here, I think the mic's coming. Sorry about that.
Thank you for your comments, everyone, and everything you're doing. I actually have 2 short questions. One, is there a fund that citizens can contribute to that would give these people money so they could bail themselves out?
They can do what?
Is there a fund that we citizens can donate money to help the people in jail who do not have violent crimes, who are waiting to be heard, that would help pay for their bail? That's my first question.
I'm still not hearing
Not
her.
that I'm
I'm not hearing you, not to my knowledge.
A lot of jurisdictions do have bail funds, community bail funds. I don't know that there's one here, but it is a model that some jurisdictions, New York has one, Chicago, there's one. So you can look and research them.
I thought you were going, let me tell you something
Yeah.
I didn't touch on that is another higher priority, is reentry. When people have done their time in jail, low-level, nonviolent, and even coming out of prison, I might suggest, we as a state and communities have to figure out a way to help these people land on their feet. The Harris County Jail is still releasing people around midnight, and it's not uncommon for a low-level offender, often a mental health diagnosed defendant, to be arrested at 4 in the morning, just a few hours later for what the hell they charge it?
Trespassing, public urination.
Trespassing. I had a gentleman that we documented, gets out at midnight, at 4 o'clock, he's on a metro train trying to find a place to get out of the weather, arrested for trespass. Our Herman Park, the large park there by the Med Center, HPD now at 11 o'clock shuts it down, and if you're in the park homeless, you will be taken to the Harris County Jail. We got to do something about that, and I thought maybe that's where you were going to help those people with some resources. We're still a pretty tight state. I think we can all agree on that. But you pay now or you pay later. So I think we've got to be very creative about how we help people stay out of the criminal justice system.
And Mark, can I just say one thing,
sure.
because the pretrial bond issues come up and the mental health, and I want to talk about one more of those proposals that we put in our grant, and it deals with those directly. One is getting a new pretrial risk assessment, because the one we have in Harris County is antiquated. You lose a point if you don't have a landline. Who's got a landline anymore? I mean, it's ridiculous. So we're looking for a new assessment that the judges will have faith in, that they can base a low bond on or be comfortable that that person's going to be okay in the community. But with the mental health, you know, the Senate Bill 1185 was money that we got to link people charged with low-level nonviolent misdemeanors in jail with mental health services. And frankly, that model did not work, because the people were taking little bits of time in jail and they were getting out before anybody from HMRA could even talk to them. So what our proposal is that at probable cause court, we're going to have a public defender there who can, and MHMRA, it's called the Harris Center now, I think, they changed the name. They're going to assess the person right then as they come in being booked. And if they assess as having mental health issues, the public defender will encourage them to cooperate, sometimes that's difficult, with the pretrial interview. And then I'm going to, at that point, be able to offer them a diversion opportunity where they will be placed in the care, and they'll get a caseworker and get the services that 1185 has allowed us to provide them. And I haven't figured out exactly the mechanics of it yet, but probably a period of time, if they stay out of trouble, they stay on their meds, cooperate with their caseworker, we won't file the case. So that's one of our more unique proposals, I think.
And an aspect of that diversion pilot program that complicated it, Ms. Anderson, and you probably know this, but I heard it and want to bring it out, was they would oftentimes get stabilized in that program, and I've got feedback that some of the individuals say, no one's ever attempted to help me. Substance abuse complicates it, but it was a mental health issue, and they get stabilized and they get ready to be released. Where do they go? Our real problem is with some folks, they are so down and out, families giving up on them, that I think we have to figure out as a agency how you give them housing and a support, and maybe some kind of reentry program where when they leave the jail, the county and the state will partner, and maybe a 2-month, 3-month transition period where they go over and they don't go back to the streets. They've got to go somewhere or they will immediately relapse, and we've wasted our time.
Hi, I'm Tracy Berry with Goodwill Central Texas, and I love what you just said. And I guess moving forward on that with reentry and diversion, how do you leverage community groups who are experts in those pieces on housing and jobs, because we know that that leads to reduced recidivism? So how do you use in transitional programs people who are already doing this really well and could work with the system before they're even released or with the courts so that when they are released, they already have a contact and we're right then and there involved in their lives.
Well, it's a resource. I mean, I don't think any of us couldn't think of some good programs that we'd implement. I mean, what I was mentioning a while ago, I've actually approached Commissioner's Court in Harris County in years past. They've got an abandoned jail across the street that's shuttered because of asbestos, and it would take a fortune to renovate the whole jail. But I said, why wouldn't you think about a couple of floors of it, and you come, if you don't have any other place to go or through an assessment deal, you would go from the jail and working with the DA as kind of a bargaining, you go over there for 2 months in your house with MHMR, counseling, you just can't take somebody that is, we already know has got problems out of the jail who've learned hopefully their lesson or got a taste of jail therapy. Number two, got some help there. And then send them out the back door of the jail, hell, in the city side of Houston, with zero money in their pocket.
Yeah.
You and I couldn't make it. So we might almost, as a condition of getting out, require them to go across the street. And it's resource. I don't, I'm talking concepts. I don't have the money. But we got to convince the state and the county that it is very economically smart on crime and economics and taxpayer money. What good would it do to lock somebody up for a couple of months because they're a vagrant trespassing? You punish them, they can't make bond, get back to my bond issue, but whatever the conditions is, they walk out the front door, they'll be back. And unfortunately, sometimes they're going to be back worse off, and they get arrested for going through people's stuff, looking for food, or sleeping on their buses, and at that point it becomes almost a social issue, but unfortunately, the social issue ends up in the criminal justice system and fills our Harris County Jail where we need to save that money for the bad guys. So to answer your question, we just got to keep having forums like this. There's some people that have got ideas and resources here. We've got to work with Commissioner's Court, the state of Texas, and just look, because now we're getting smart in identifying the real cause of a lot of these low-level criminal acts. At the same time, we're all together on locking up the bad guys for long periods of time. But what's interfering with that program is this huge population of just people that we're mad at, they can't get their act together, and the sad news is oftentimes they graduate and become the bad guys. So anyway, I talk too much, I know that.
Do you have a question down there?
Hi, Mike Goldman from Governor Abbott's office. Mr. Levin, you mentioned that there are issues with the way that deferred adjudication is currently funded around the state, and I know a little about it and what a complicated system it is, and you mentioned that something might be done next session. What are some views that either you or some of the panelists have about how that might be restructured?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking about that. And what's interesting is if you look at the difference between how we fund juvenile probation versus adult probation, and I would submit we'd be better off moving towards the juvenile probation model. With adult probation, we funded, the basic funding is based on how many people in that county are on adult probation. And of course, that means if they're diverted through pre-charge diversion, like Devon Anderson talked about, the Harris County is not going to get the money, and yet they still need to follow up and make sure they completed their program, and they need to pay for the treatment and all of that. So they're actually disadvantaging themselves financially by doing that. And then the other aspect is the longer somebody's on probation, we saw the slide that Zoe had about front-loading resources. Most of the failures are within your first 2 years. So what you have, though, is people on probation for 5 or 10 years who may have been exemplary that should be early terminated, but they don't really need supervision anymore, but they're subsidizing the other people on probation because they're paying probation fees, but they don't need supervision. Over half the probation budget for these 121 probation departments comes from the probation fees. So what we need to do, I think, is look at not basing it on how many people are on probation, but looking at things like the population of the county, how many people are arrested for felonies and so forth, but also looking at the risk level of people that are on probation. So counties that have a higher risk level, higher needs level based on these assessments would get more funding. And we now have statewide all probation departments using the same validated assessment instrument. So those are some of my views. And of course, we could also look at some incentives, for example, for reducing technical revocations and so forth. So for people, to understand this, over half the people coming into prisons nationally, and Texas about the same, are revocations from probation or parole. And about half of those are technical revocations, not people who committed a new crime, but they missed appointments, they tested positive for drugs and so forth, which obviously tends to indicate a new crime was committed, but still it's a technical revocation. So the point is, through things like the Hope Court, you can have people going to jail for the weekend, knowing instead of these swift and certain sanctions, instead of letting the violations pile up and then revoking them to prison. So anyway, I wanted to turn it over also to our panelists to comment on that. But those are some of my thoughts.
I would just add that I got hit in the face with that just recently by Dr. May, because she was saying, well, that's great that you're going to expand the diversion, but that means all the people you're giving diversion, they used to get deferred. And so now I'm not going to have those people. And I didn't even realize, that's what I keep learning, is that we're all so intertwined, and my decisions affect a whole bunch of other people. And so we have a good enough relationship with everybody in Harris County, we can talk through those things at the coordinating council. So it's definitely an issue.
And obviously that's the part of trying to get smart and realizing criminal justice is a system. And when you have any breakdown, whether it's from the street officer all the way through the prison system, if you got one link, and probation needs to modernize. For instance, why, and I think it's in statute, every probationer's got to be tested for drug and alcohol. If you're in there for shoplifting or hot checks, something totally unrelated to alcohol or substance abuse, why are you putting the probationer through a $40 drug test? I don't know, monthly, weekly, whatever. I just think, let me give you another classic example. I ran across a federal parolee 2 days ago, and I said, how much longer are you on parole? Next summer. I said, how often do you report? He said, I report by internet each month. So what did I do? I called our parole division, and I said, do we have anything where a nonviolent, compliant, someone that's worked with you so well could start doing an internet report? Our guys said, well, Senator, one, we want to make sure it's the real person answering over the internet. There's a way to authenticate that. Number two, sometimes we'd like to see them. Sometimes you can see them. You can tell how they're doing. I say, Brian Collier, you can find a booger bear to anything you want to try to do. But if you get innovative to save money, to allow you to spend more time with those who need intensive supervision, why wouldn't you let some individual that's got a perfect record of complying, with the way to authenticate it, report over the internet? We've got to continue to modernize every element of criminal justice so we can get the most bang for our dollar. And I could get started on TDCJ and spend the rest of the day. We just simply don't do it. Why I had him on the phone yesterday, I said, are y'all going to ever come up with another recommendation of which prison to close? We've closed 3. They didn't recommend any of them. Our office came up with it. He said, well, we're still waiting for y'all to come up with the next one. Give me a break. But anyway, probation needs to get away from where there's an incentive to keep people on probation because they need the money. And the judges obviously play a critical role in that.
So, and there was a bill several years ago, which we can update, that didn't quite make it, but it dealt with all of that, and it front-loaded the funding, and it made the departments whole to some degree for early terminations, because there is an early termination procedure, both for probation and parole. It's not used that often, but there are people that have done great. They paid their restitution. They shouldn't be on supervision anymore. So let's see, do we have any more questions here in our audience? Otherwise, I will give our panelists an opportunity if there's anything you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to say before to wrap things up. But we do have a luncheon and starting in a couple minutes with Governor Abbott. So I guess we will go ahead and head to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good to see you, man. Thank you.